In the shadows of Latin America, an old game seems to be resurfacing, one that many thought had ended with the Cold War. According to a report by the New York Times, the Donald Trump administration quietly authorized the CIA to carry out covert operations in Venezuela, reigniting fears of Washington's clandestine reach in the region. This new directive, given under Trump's watch, empowers the CIA to conduct lethal covert missions against Venezuelan officials and operations inside the country, marking one of the most aggressive U.S. intelligence authorizations in Latin America in decades. While the administration publicly framed these moves as part of an anti-narcotics and anti-corruption push, officials privately admitted the broader goal was clear: regime change in Caracas and the removal of Nicolás Maduro. The timing of the authorization is striking. For years, Washington has accused Maduro's socialist government of corruption, drug trafficking, and human rights abuses. But behind those accusations lies a deeper geopolitical motivation. Venezuela's vast oil reserves, the largest in the world, and its growing alignment with U.S. adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran. The Trump administration's move reflects a familiar pattern, blending moral justification with strategic interest. What began as a campaign of sanctions and diplomatic isolation now appears to have entered a covert phase, reminiscent of the 1980s when the CIA quietly backed coups, armed rebels, and plotted assassinations across the Americas in the name of democracy. Publicly, President Trump didn't hide his ambitions. Speaking to reporters after the New York Times revelation, he said, "We are certainly looking at land now because we've got the sea very well under control." The statement was cryptic but telling, implying that U.S. operations, previously limited to maritime zones under the banner of anti-drug missions, might soon extend inside Venezuelan territory. Recent U.S. naval actions off Venezuela's coast have already turned deadly, with officials confirming that at least 27 people were killed in raids on boats alleged to be involved in drug trafficking. But sources close to the operation suggest these missions served a dual purpose: weakening Maduro's control of key maritime routes and signaling Washington's readiness to escalate beyond sanctions. Under the new CIA authority, covert actions could include direct operations against members of the Venezuelan government, or even Maduro himself. While U.S. officials have not confirmed any ongoing missions, intelligence insiders describe the authorization as unusually broad, giving the agency freedom of initiative across the Caribbean and South America. This flexibility mirrors past CIA mandates that blurred the line between espionage and direct intervention. Meanwhile, Pentagon planners have reportedly begun preparing options for Trump's review, including limited strikes on Venezuelan soil, a scenario that, if realized, would mark the most serious confrontation between Washington and Caracas in modern history. To understand the implications, one must look backward, to the long and complicated history of U.S. covert operations in Latin America. The CIA's involvement in the region stretches back to the early days of the Cold War, beginning with Guatemala in 1954. There, the agency orchestrated a coup to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz, who had dared to challenge American corporate interests like the United Fruit Company through land reforms. Framed as a crusade against communism, the operation set a precedent. Washington would intervene wherever it perceived ideological threats in its hemisphere. The result, however, was catastrophic. Guatemala descended into a brutal civil war that lasted more than 30 years and claimed around 150,000 lives. Just a few years later, in 1961, the CIA carried out the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Hundreds of Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the agency, launched an assault aimed at toppling Fidel Castro's revolutionary government. The operation was a disaster, poorly coordinated, lacking local support, and quickly crushed by Castro's forces. Nearly 1 to 200 invaders were captured, and the humiliation deepened Cold War tensions. Yet the CIA didn't stop there. Declassified records and a 1975 Senate Intelligence Committee report revealed at least 8 separate attempts by the agency to assassinate Castro, through poisoned cigars, contaminated diving suits, and even explosive seashells. Some plots involved collaboration with American mobsters, blending espionage with organized crime in ways that still astonish historians. The playbook extended beyond Cuba. In 1961, the CIA supplied weapons to the plotters who assassinated Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, a figure Washington had once supported. 6 years later, CIA operatives helped track down revolutionary icon Che Guevara in Bolivia, where he was captured and executed. In Chile during the 1970s, the agency's hand was again evident. When socialist leader Salvador Allende took office, President Richard Nixon famously instructed the CIA to make the economy scream. The agency funded strikes, anti-government propaganda, and economic sabotage, creating conditions that culminated in the 1973 coup by General Augusto Pinochet. Allende died in the assault on the presidential palace, and Chile entered a 16-year dictatorship marked by torture and repression. Though Washington denied direct involvement, declassified documents later confirmed extensive CIA funding of opposition groups and covert destabilization campaigns. Against this backdrop, the CIA's revived activities in Venezuela feel less like a new chapter and more like a return to form. The ideological landscape may have changed, communism replaced by anti-authoritarian rhetoric, but the methods remain hauntingly familiar. Venezuela, isolated economically and diplomatically, finds itself once again at the intersection of global rivalries. For Washington, unseating Maduro would weaken Russia's influence in the Western Hemisphere and secure a foothold in an oil-rich nation long resistant to US pressure. For critics, however, the move risks destabilizing Latin America all over again, reviving a cycle of covert wars, insurgencies, and humanitarian crises. Inside Venezuela, the atmosphere is tense. Maduro has long accused the United States of plotting his overthrow, citing failed attempts such as the 2019 Operation Gideon, when a small group of mercenaries attempted an amphibious landing near Caracas. Now, with reports of new CIA mandates, his government is tightening internal security and reinforcing ties with Russia and Iran. For ordinary Venezuelans, already battered by economic collapse and sanctions, the prospect of another foreign intervention brings back painful memories of past decades when superpower games played out on Latin American. As the Trump-era authorization continues to draw scrutiny, the echoes of history are impossible to ignore. From Guatemala to Chile, the pattern has remained strikingly consistent. Interventions that begin with the promise of liberation often end in long-term instability. The New York Times report has reignited debate in Washington, with critics warning that covert operations risk dragging the US into yet another open-ended entanglement. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that Maduro's regime represents a legitimate threat to democracy and regional stability. But for Latin Americans, the memories of CIA coups and proxy wars remain vivid. Whether the new Venezuela operation will mark another dark chapter or a decisive turning point will depend on what the agency does next, and how much the world learns about it before it's too late.